following is a Comfortably Zoned Radio Network production.
Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, whatever time you may be listening. Welcome to another edition of Ask Claire along the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network. I'm your host. My name is Claire Hall, and as you have learned, if you've been listening to this program over the past few months as we've gotten our footing here on the network, I talk about anything that interests me, but I keep returning again and again to some of my real passions, real interests, and as you know, one of those is baseball, and today's show is going to be an extra special one because, again, we've talked about my favorite team in all of baseball history is the Brooklyn Dodgers. My favorite player and manager is a gentleman named Gil Hodges, and today it is really a pleasure and honor for me to welcome to the microphone his eldest daughter, Irene Hodges. Irene, welcome, and thank you for being here.
Thank you so much, Claire. It's my pleasure.
And even though this program will be uploaded after our date of recording, I think it is especially appropriate that we are recording on Veterans Day, and even though we're going to focus in the conversation on your dad's baseball career, the fact that he was a proud United States Marine in the Pacific in World War II, as was my own father, I think it's very nice, very appropriate that we're having this conversation today as well.
I think it's wonderful. I think my dad, as your dad probably was such a proud Marine, so proud of his country, and I'm happy to do it on such a special day.
Oh, yes, indeed. And so, in brief, for people who don't know about Gil Hodges, he was a Major League first baseman, primarily with the Brooklyn Dodgers, and later Los Angeles Dodgers and New York Mets, part of the famous Boys of Summer. Hit 370 career home runs, which at the time he retired had him in the top 10, a flawless fielder, an extremely popular player. Right after retirement, went into managing several seasons with the expansion Washington Senators before he got to come home to New York and managed the Mets and the great miracle of 1969, the team that in the space of a couple of seasons went from the laughingstock of baseball to world champions. So, lots of us can talk about that from the perspective of fans, as am I, but we want to look at Gil Hodges through a different lens. There are only very few people on this earth who had the privilege of calling him Dad, and you're one of them. And so maybe let's just start off by talking about your childhood, growing up in Brooklyn, and the daughter of Gil Hodges, and just what was it like growing up with a father who was so really well known?
Well, we led a very normal life. There was nothing exceptional about us. We lived in Brooklyn. My brother and my sisters and I went to school in Brooklyn. During the winter, it was really very normal because my dad was home. So we'd eat, we'd do homework, we'd, do things like that. Not until I got a little older, and maybe 8th grade or beginning of high school, did I even realize that he was that famous. And it was strange. I mean, my friends were my friends always. I have the same friends I have for 55 years. They came to my house like they would go to anybody's house. He was just my dad as he was to all of us. And I think the biggest thing was my dad was from Indiana. And living in Brooklyn, my mother is Italian, as you know.
Yes.
I think that difficult, not difficult, that was change. But he loved Brooklyn, and the people loved him. And I think because he was average. You know, he'd walk to church on Sunday. Fridays, we'd usually have pizza because at that time you couldn't eat meat. He'd walk and pick up pizza for us. He loved to walk. So we led a very average, normal life.
Well, yeah, and as you were sharing that story, one picture popped into my brain, for people listening who don't know, I'm one of the administrators of the Gil Hodges Belongs in the Hall of Fame group on Facebook, and a press photo that was taken after the Dodgers won the 1959 World Series. And there's your dad in front of your house wearing his Dodger cap and raking the leaves. And I just thought, how wonderful. And nowadays, ball players, they don't go walk to church in their community. They don't, they don't pick up pizza themselves. They don't rake the leaves. They've got people who do all those things for them. And I just wonder if that's part of the reason that people felt bonded to baseball players back then in a way that maybe they don't now.
I understand that. I mean, he was a part of the community. Absolutely. When we had snowstorms, because, as I said, he was home in the winter, he'd take out the sled coming from Indiana. I'm sure he was used to all that snow. And, he'd take us all sledding. We'd pick up all my friends as we went down the street because you couldn't drive. And he was just a family man. That's the easiest way to say it. His family always came first. And in the winter, it was wonderful because we got to enjoy that all the time.
Oh, that's just neat. That's heartwarming. What about, being out in the community, going out for dinner or whatever that, yeah, I have read so many stories about people approaching him to talk, to ask for an autograph, and, of course, he always responded with kindness and patience. And did you ever get a sense of, kind of having to share him with the rest of Brooklyn and the rest of the world, or just was that part of life?
That's how I was brought up. There was nothing unusual about it. I can tell you a funny story.
Sure.
When I was probably 14 or 15, and we went to the bakery, and he had already won the 69 World Series. So I must have been 16. And he had his World Series ring on, and he went to pay the woman in the bakery. And she said to him, "Wow, what a beautiful school ring you have on." And he started to laugh. And he said, "Well, thank you." And then she said, "What school did you go to?" And now it was starting to get into going on longer. And of course, I was ready to go already. And he said, "Well, to be honest with you, it's not a school ring, it's a work ring." So I'm just like looking at him and rolling my eyes and saying, "Come on, let's go." And he's going, just a minute. So she said, "Oh, what kind of work do you do?" And he's still not just giving her what she's asking for. So he said, "I play baseball." He said, "and I was fortunate enough to be on a very good team, play with very good players, and this is the gift they gave us." And that was it. She was happy with that. He never told her it was, the Mets or anything like that. And walking out, I'm thinking, couldn't you have just told her the story would have ended like 10 minutes ago, Daddy? And he said, I really didn't want to do that. I prefer doing it this way. And that is him. That's exactly how he was. Humble, quiet, very proud. It means not proud of who he was, but he was just like that,
Yeah, I don't know about you, Irene, but in retrospect, I want to talk on the program, and maybe we could now, and maybe return to the theme as well. The sad thing is that he's been gone so many years, passed away in 1972 at the too young age of 47, just a few days before his 48th birthday. But all these years, I think the Facebook group is such amazing evidence of not just the fond baseball memories that people have of him as a player and a manager, but the true esteem, affection, and love that people had and still have for him.
Yes,
Any
and
thoughts
it
on that?
is, I will tell you that it amazes me. It really does, and he was my dad, but it amazes me how far the reach was of him, of his being a person. And not only a ball player, but the person he was. And I am always so humbled by the outpour of love towards my dad. And he was an amazing man for me, but to see how many people feel the same way, it's just, I can't imagine how he would feel about that, because he wasn't the type of individual that ever boasted or in any respect about himself. So I think he would be in such shock about it, really. And when he doesn't get into the Hall of Fame, this past voting, I felt so sorry for you and all the people that love him and work. I didn't feel sorry for myself because honestly, it doesn't matter to me one way or another. But for everybody that has worked so hard and loves him so much, that's who I felt sorry for and felt bad about.
Oh, thank you, Irene. I had a brief moment of thinking to myself, I've let him down. But then I realized, no.
Oh, goodness, you could never do that. Never.
No. And for all the people, sometimes people on the page want to, thank me, for doing this and say what a great thing I'm doing. And I say, hey, I am just the latest, as I consider myself in a whole line of folks who have carried this banner, and unfortunately, some of them are no longer with us. The gentleman who founded the Brooklyn Dodgers Hall of Fame, the writer and documentary filmmaker Marino Amoruso, that we'll just keep going until they get it right. And something I observed on Facebook the other day, I said, I always try to think that most things happen in this world for a reason, and I said, I dearly wish he had had this honor many, many, many years ago because he so deserves it. But if he had been in years ago, I don't think I would have become acquainted with you, you and I become friends, and again through Facebook. Through our mutual admiration of your dad, I've become friends with just some of the most amazing, extraordinary people. But I said, it shouldn't surprise me that the best fans are Gil Hodges fans.
No, that's very kind, and it honestly is so true. You see it every day on Facebook. Even people that you meet randomly. They always have such wonderful things to say. So it's a wonderful feeling for sure.
That's great. So back to his career a little bit. 1958, when the Dodgers left Brooklyn for Los Angeles. So do you have many memories of that and how it impacted your family life and how your dad adapted to suddenly playing his home games 3,000 miles away?
Well, I was very young then, thank God. And I remember my mother being so upset because I don't think that she had ever been that far away from her family. So it was a tremendous adjustment. And, Brooklyn was home, Ebbets Field was home. Now you went to Dodger Stadium and a new city that we had never been to. So it was a tremendous adjustment. I can tell you personally, my family, it was very difficult. I remember receiving communion in LA, and it was very difficult. You know, nobody really visited us because it was so far, so it was hard. We didn't have any family there. So it was a difficult move for sure.
And then a story I've heard, I've never asked you, can you verify or not, or I know you were still pretty young, in 1960 when Ebbets Field was demolished, you know, some of the Brooklyn Dodgers were there, including Roy Campanella and Carl Erskine, but what I read somewhere was that your dad decided the family would go down to spring training early so he wouldn't have to see it happen himself.
Yeah. It was part of him. It absolutely was. I mean, he loved playing ball in Brooklyn. He felt so honored. You know, he didn't feel it was a job. He felt that he was honored. And when you say he would stand and sign autographs while we sat in a car at times for an hour. He was always the last one. He never refused anybody because he was so grateful to the fans who loved him.
Yeah, and that's wonderful. You know, as I was preparing for this program, I just did a lot of thinking, and as, you know, people talk about their encounters with ball players a lot, and then, but, you know, even ones who have reputations as being nice guys, it almost seems inevitably that somebody comes up with, well, I saw him at a show one time and he was really grouchy and wouldn't talk to anybody. You know, but I could only think of two players that I have never come across a story of any fan having a negative encounter with them: Stan Musial and Gil Hodges.
Yeah.
That's pretty good company, huh?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And then a few years after that big move out west, your dad got to come home. You know, not to Ebbets Field, which sadly was gone, but close by to Manhattan and the Mets, and thoughts and memories of that happening.
It was very exciting. I will say that it was very exciting. So, you know, the Mets were a new ballpark, a new team. Everything was, the fans were thrilled. Everything was exciting about it. Of course, it was his career winding down. And, you know, how wonderful of the Dodgers to have him come home.
And, you know, I'm sorry, go ahead. Yeah, and, you know, I've looked at the statistics a bit much, although, you know, I think the whole theme of this program is, you know, Gil Hodges was about so much more than statistics, but, you know, I believe it was one of his knees he had, you know, really injured badly a couple of years earlier, and he never really fully recovered from that, but that especially in the first months of that 1962 season, he was pretty much the regular Mets first baseman, and for that period of time, it really looked to me like he was playing like the Gil Hodges of old. I'm sure he was thrilled to be home. He wanted to give the New York fans the very best he could, but then unfortunately his knee just wouldn't take it, and that was when he kind of moved into the part-time backup and pinch hitter and late inning reserve role, which of course I'm sure he carried as best he could until the opportunity came along the next year, 1963, to retire as a player and become a manager. And maybe can you talk about that transition and what appealed to him about managing?
Well, as I said before, Frank Slocum was his closest confidant, who was in baseball for many, many, many years. He was the assistant commissioner of baseball under Ford Frick. It was a long conversation it was hours and hours before he felt comfortable to make that decision. And he was a great leader. He was even before he became a manager, he was not a follower. He was such a strong-minded individual. He knew right from wrong. He knew the game inside out. He was a tremendous ball player. And after he reached that decision, he wasn't sure he could do it. He wasn't sure he was meant to do that, but he was. And after he made that decision, and he told us, it was very exciting. I mean, at the time, the Senators were not a good ball club.
Right.
Going to that ballpark was not easy. Washington was pretty much a football. They loved their football. So
they weren't a baseball town like New York at all.
No, not at all. So that was a big transition for him. But it was a great learning experience for him. And I think that's where he found his footing in Washington before he came back to the Mets.
And, you know, something that I probably didn't appreciate as a 10-year-old just falling in love with the Mets, and if people ask me, well, why are you so passionate about Gil Hodges anyway? And I said, summer of 1969, 9 years old, Mets, Gil Hodges, reading The Boys of Summer a few years later, that's the story. But the strategic thinking and I think my favorite quote that sums up how I see his ability to approach the game, I think, came from Tug McGraw, and the clip I saw, Tug McGraw said, "Other managers played checkers, Gil Hodges played chess."
It's a great quote from Tug, absolutely, and he knew him so well. You know, he took each player and treated them as an individual, not as a group, but as an individual. He knew their strengths, he knew their weaknesses, but he always gave them respect, no matter what. And that's something he gave, and it's something he demanded. And not all of them were that easy, but in retrospect, as they got older and realized what he was trying to instill in them, they all had respect for him, and they all cared for him and his ability as a manager.
Very much so.
He wasn't easy. He wasn't easy.
Oh, no. But yeah, he demanded the best, but he you know, so much of, as we've talked about, leading by example. And, you know, it's amazing how that example, you know, inspired the players. You know, I've had one long conversation with your brother, and I think I've heard him tell this story in other settings as well, but, you know, it's maybe before the 1969 World Series. He said he was sitting in your dad's office at Shea Stadium, you know, looking over the media department's put out roster sheets, and he's looking at the Baltimore Orioles sheet, and, you know, Boog Powell and Frank Robinson and Brooks Robinson and Jim Palmer and all. Yeah, great hitters, great pitchers, and he basically said something like, well, Dad, how do you think you're going to beat these guys? And that he stood up, closed the office door, and said something like, I've got 25 guys sitting out there who believe in themselves, and that's enough.
That's it. That is him in a nutshell. And that's what he taught them. That's what, not to be a joke, not to be lazy, but to always do your best, because that's what he did.
Right. You know, I've gone back, read a lot of stories, and for people who don't know the early history of the Mets, you know, an expansion team that they did bring in, you know, a lot of players who had been great but were at the end of their careers, you know, like your dad, Duke Snyder, but they had a lot of, Richie Ashburn's another, and there were others, but they had, you know, unfortunately they had a very rough time those first few years, and they it almost got to the point where, people were calling them the lovable losers and almost celebrating their incompetence,
Right.
and
They weren't taken seriously as ball players, and it became, the clowns.
Oh yeah, and then your dad came in, and that even before they started rising in 1968, when your dad came in, I remember seeing commentaries along the lines of Gil Hodges has made it clear that the days of the lovable losers are over.
Right. He would never accept that. He would never be a part of that. Never.
Yeah. Yeah. So how about if we talked about this a little bit before we started recording the program, but the very special bond that your father had with Tom Seaver.
Okay. Well, I think, number one, Tom had a tremendous respect for my dad, as my dad had for Tom. He was very young. He was very, very talented. He was a Marine, and I think those are all the qualities that made him the person he is. Tom Seaver was a great man, and is a great man, for sure.
Mm-hmm.
And I think they had such respect for each other that formed their friendship. It wasn't that they would go out to eat. That would never happen, or anything like that. But a friendship for sure.
Yeah, and one thing that, every few months I like to post on the Facebook page in case somebody hasn't seen it yet, or just to remind people, Tom Seaver's Hall of Fame induction speech from 1992, and every time I watch it, I get a big lump in my throat, and it is a wonderful speech, and he thanks all the people who were the greatest influences on his life, and the very last person he acknowledges is his mother, of course. I mean, who wouldn't put your mother as probably the first influence in your life? But very next to last, your dad, and he said some absolutely marvelous things about him, and
he's always loves him, and he always acknowledges him whenever he can. I will say, when we went, I believe it was the last game at Shea Stadium, and my family went, and Tom was there, and a lot of the players were there, and they introduced them on the field, and they were showing highlights on the big screen of all the years at Shea Stadium. And when they got to my dad, Tom covered his heart and pointed to the sky, like to him. So, he never forgets him, and we only have the utmost respect for Tom always.
Yeah, just a Hall of Fame pitcher. Basically my favorite player when I was growing up, something else that just comes to mind, speaking of anniversaries, and, your dad has never fallen really out of the public mind, especially in New York, but everywhere. But I imagine next summer, the summer of 2019, the 50th anniversary of the world champion Mets, that's going to bring a lot of reminiscing, about a lot of celebrations, and one thing that immediately comes to my mind is hopefully a whole other generation of fans will be introduced to him and what a special player, manager, and human being he was.
Yeah, thank you. That'll be nice. It'll be a wonderful celebration for sure.
Yes, and Irene, I think it's about time we bring the conversation to a close, but just one thing in one of our earlier conversations, I think a personal conversation, but you said it was okay if we shared this on the program again as we're recording on Veterans Day, which is also the day after November 10th, which is the birthday of the U.S. Marine Corps, and we were talking about the fact that both of our dads were proud World War II Marine veterans, and I think I mentioned that my father would sing me to sleep every night and always close with the Marines hymn, and you shared with me something?
Yes.
Wouldn't mind telling.
Whenever I used to go in the car a lot with him to stores and things like that. And he would always teach me the Battle Hymn of the Republic. Always. And he was not a good singer, but the fact remains he would teach that to me, and we'd sing it together anytime we went to the stores or anytime we had alone time in the car. So that's very special.
From the halls of Montezuma. Yep. All right. Irene Hodges, my guest today on Ask Claire. Thank you so much, Irene, for a program that has been, an extra special pleasure.
As always, it's my pleasure.
Yes. Thanks, everybody, for listening. And until we meet again, take care.